Hi everyone, Michael Britt here. Now, I'm very proud that the Psych Files podcast has been so successful. It passed the 20 million download mark. And a lot of that success is due to my episodes on how you can use proven memory strategies to remember just about anything, from memorizing terms for a test to remembering people's names at a party or a meeting, or even memorizing speeches. It's amazing how useful these strategies are. So, I put all of these episodes into one audio course. The course is called Hippos, Aliens, and Llamas: Quickly Master the Tricks to a Great Memory. And it's available now on avid.fm/memorymaster. All one word. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 295 of the Psych Files. In this episode, I want to try to answer this question. You know those inspirational videos that you share on Facebook? Well, what makes some of them inspirational? Because I'll bet you received some of these, right? Someone sends you a video to make your day or to inspire you. Some of them work, some of them don't. And that's what we're going to look at today. It's kind of broadly related to motivation. You know, what really gets you going? And I think that's an interesting topic. So we're going to talk about that. Okay, so you want to be popular on social media. You want to send around those inspiring videos. I'm always a little hesitant. I'm not particularly happy with the way that the broader topic of motivation is captured in our psychology textbooks. You know, we talk about, of course, Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy. It's okay. I mean, it's sort of hard to deny that there isn't something to that hierarchy. It's just that it's pretty vague, you know. Are we motivated by safety needs? Sure. Yes. Are we motivated to eat, to survive? You know. Are we motivated by belongingness? Okay. So it's all right. It is definitely one of those things you do have to learn. And we also learn about needs-based things like need for achievement. But in general, I just don't find them very helpful. The one motivation theory that I've talked about a few times here, actually there's two that I really find some value in, and that would be expectancy theory, which is a cognitive-based theory, which says basically that we make decisions to do one thing or another based upon what we expect to happen as a result of doing that. Expectancy theory, sometimes referred to as VIE, valence, instrumentality, and expectancy. Probably my favorite is called self-determination theory. Talked about that in episode 254. So there are a few good theories. But this is about inspiration, and there's been a great piece of research out this year in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that talks about why we find some things inspiring and other things not. And by things, I mean usually they're stories about people. And so the article is called The Power and Limits of Personal Change: When a Bad Past Does and Does Not Inspire in the Present. So good piece of research by Nadav Klein and Ed O'Brien, University of Chicago. Okay, so what's it all about? Well, let's imagine your typical, successful, viral, inspirational video. What is it about? It's about a person who has overcome a difficult past. Those are the kinds of stories that we really like to hear. But what about, have you ever heard the story, I heard it years ago, about some guy who retired as a postman, a post person, and he had been in the Postal Service for like 40 years and never missed a day. Maybe you've heard something similar anyway. A story about a person who consistently did their job. And related to this, I think, is how often do we hear the lament, why don't we consider teachers as heroes? Why don't we have heroes in everyday life? I know there's some sort of program on, I think at CNN, but we don't tend to do that, right? And part of the reason is because we love stories that really pull us in, stories that we can identify with. We particularly love, if you ever watch the Olympics, of course, they love to show you the backstory, particularly the person, the athlete, who came from a difficult background. Those are the stories you really want to watch. And same thing with like American Idol or, So You Think You Can Dance. They love to profile the people who came from a difficult background. Not so much, the person who just kind of worked hard, nothing particularly unusual about their circumstances. So the authors wanted to look into that. So let me just state their hypothesis here, because I think it's interesting. We test the hypothesis that people find inspiration in observing others who accomplish meaningful, positive change in their lives by shedding destructive behaviors, even more so than in observing others who maintain consistently positive lives without any negative past from which to change. In other words, a person who changes from bad to good may, ironically, be regarded more positively than a person who only and always has set a good example. And they also ask, how do we make that person, the teacher, the postal worker, how do we present that person as an inspiration to other people, to the younger generation? I mean, I think that's a good question, because not everybody is going to have some difficult circumstances out of which they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and yet we do want to celebrate the common person. So how do we turn the postal worker into a hero? Now, they had a couple of scenarios that they used in this study. They created a fictional person named Carl, and they used, by the way, the Mechanical Turk, which is where you can get people to do small tasks for you for a small amount of pay. I think Amazon started that service, and it's quite popular among researchers to use people who are around the world. So they created this guy, Carl, fictional, and they had to, in some cases, give him things that he needed to overcome. And those would be some of the typical stuff, like losing weight. So some people heard that Carl used to be overweight and now is in shape. We look at how inspirational that is compared to a fictional Carl who has always maintained a pretty much the same weight. Now, they do point out that previous research has shown that, as they say, quote here, generally people prefer improving sequences of stimuli, which is a researcher's way, right, of saying that stories in which things get better as they go along, more than we prefer flat or decreasing sequences. They make an interesting example here, which is, which one would you rather have first? I'm sure you've heard this. Do you want the good news first or the bad news first? Well, think about that for just a second. Do you want to hear the good news first or the bad news first? Well, most people want to hear the bad news first because we like things to get better as they move along. The other thing that we sometimes hear is people will say something like, well, I had a difficult time, but it made me the person I am today. I find that quote, that saying that very odd. These things made you the person that you are today. Well, first off, that's a self-esteem bias. I mean, if you ask people what made them the people they are today, they will probably point to, some people will point to their parents, but we'll probably point to our attitudes, our personality, the way that we are. We attribute our success to ourselves, right? There's a sort of a self-esteem bias there. We like to feel good about ourselves. And so we, of course, disregard, or we never noticed in the first place, that the reasons for our success were sometimes, a lot of the times maybe, external. So do you attribute your success to you being simply born in the United States, where there were a lot of opportunities? Do you attribute some of your success to the fact that you are white or middle class, or that your family had connections? I don't know how often we do that. All right, so let's go back to our fictional Carl, who, as I mentioned, sometimes overcame difficult circumstances. Perhaps he was overweight, not overweight anymore, used drugs, or excessively drank, or excessively gambled. Other difficult past experiences that they overcame were, they also used here, being mentally unstable and going bankrupt. Okay, so you do an experiment in which you create, little stories about Carl, and in some of these instances, he overcomes his gambling or excessive drinking, and in other cases where Carl has successfully avoided going bankrupt or getting into drugs or gambling. Okay, so you give these two different stories to your subjects, and then the researchers here created what they called an inspiration index, which was a bunch of questions in which they asked people, after they read the story, to rate Carl on these various dimensions, such as how inspiring is Carl, how praiseworthy, how moral, how respectable, how likable, admirable, etc. 1 to 9 scale, add those all up, and we get an inspiration index. Now, they're also looking at what they think is one of the key reasons why we find people who struggle and succeed. Why do we find them so inspirational? And it has to do with effort. Because we know how difficult our lives are. We know that our lives are filled with ups and downs. And so we can identify more with Carl when he has those same kinds of things. If Carl consistently avoids something, well, we can't identify with that. We can't put ourselves in his shoes if he's always been successful. So the key thing, and we'll see this theme again in just a second, is the element of effort. So they asked people, how much effort do you think was involved in Carl's life? How much struggle was there? Okay, so what are the results in this one? Because they did a bunch of these small sub-studies. And sure enough, so this is step number one. This is just to verify that what we're thinking about here is correct. Sure enough, Carl was found to be more inspirational when he overcame these negative consequences in his early life. So, more inspirational, and there was a sense that he must have had to extend greater effort in his life in order to get there. So, as they say here, quote, participants assumed that change was more effortful than stability. So that's part of it, is that if you're the same, if you're able to resist becoming a gambler, we assume that there's no effort involved in that. Whereas if you were a gambler and now you're not a gambler, there was a lot of effort involved in that, and I can identify with effort, and so I find that inspirational. So if that's the case, then how do we make the always good, the consistent, reliable Carl, how do we make him more inspirational? And so they did another study on that, and what they did was they rewrote the story a little bit. And this is the connection here, is how do we make the teacher or the postal worker, how do we make his or her story more inspirational? What we have to do is we have to consider that element of effort. When you tell the story of reliable Carl, who's been at the same job for 40 years, you have to include how hard that was to do. Because going to the same job for 40 years, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's a little bit hard. It depends. I'm going to identify with Carl, or the teacher who's been a teacher for 25 years, 30 years. I'm going to identify and be inspired by the story if you could also tell me how hard it was to do that. Right? So you've got to bring out more of the elements about how difficult it is to remain consistent. So, for example, if you're going with a story about gambling, and you say that someone never was a gambler, okay, not very inspiring. So you've got to include the elements about, okay, but he came from a family in which the parents were gamblers. He grew up in an environment where gambling was part of how people made their lives. Many of his friends became gambling addicts. You've got to make it clear, if we're going to make ordinary people inspiring, how hard it is to resist the temptations. Because sure enough, when they told Carl's story about not being consistent, his level of inspiration matched the fictional Carl's level of inspiration when the story mentioned how hard it was for Carl to stay out of trouble, if you will, or to remain reliable. Because as the researchers point out, without that information, we're just going to assume it was easy. Or as they say, the default perception that stability is not effortful. One easy way to change the postman story is to place the postman in Alaska, let's say. Is it harder to be a postman in, what do they call them, a postal worker in Alaska or in Florida? Which one do you prefer? Which one do you admire more? 40 years in Alaska or 40 years in Florida? Didn't mean to insult anyone in Alaska. In fact, I guess I admire you more up there. Okay, now there's more here. Does it matter what you overcame? Well, yes, there are instances where even if you overcame it, we are probably not going to admire you. Now, you might be wondering what that instance would be. Well, let me ask you a question. This week, when this was being recorded, we heard about a man in Hollywood who, for many years, sexually abused women. Now, suppose this person goes to a clinic and comes out 5 years later and says, I feel that I've overcome the urges that I had that made me do that, and I'm a better person now. What do you think of that guy? Is that inspirational? Of course, you might say, well, yeah, but he's only saying that now. He's only been good for the past 5 years, whereas he was bad for longer amounts of time. But so rewrite the story a little bit and come up with a person who, let's say, sexually molested children for 10 years, but now has not been doing that, has overcome those urges and is not doing that anymore. It hasn't done it for many years. Inspirational? No, right? So it's important what it is exactly the person overcame and what the researchers here refer to as social harm. So if you overcame something that really was mostly just hurting you, like gambling, drug abuse, going bankrupt, well, those things really just hurt you mostly. But what if what you did hurt others? Now, again, what they refer to as social harm. So instead of using drugs, what if you sold drugs? What if we made a story about Carl in which he was a drug dealer, or he was a bully? What if we have a story about Carl and he bullied other kids for a long time and now stopped? Well, of course, you might attribute that to him being older. What about they used the example of a cheater? What if you used to cheat on your spouse, but you don't anymore? Inspirational? Well, of course we had to subject that to research, and that's what they did. They had 324 of those Amazons M-Turk, and they read the descriptions about a person. And again, the behaviors were gambling, drugs, bullying, and cheating, and whether or not this fictional person, again, Carl, used to do those things, and other people were clearly harmed in him doing so. Well, the stories fell kind of flat. As their quote here, a person who used to cheat but has since reformed was no more inspiring than a person who never cheated in the first place. A person who used to bully others but has since reformed was no more inspiring than someone who never bullied in the first place. In fact, what the patterns they observed here were actually somewhat in the opposite direction, in that you were less inspiring when you went from a destructive bad past to an okay past. So we have to be careful about what kind of thing you overcame. As these authors state here, the key to inspiration seems to lie not in being exemplary, but in being able to communicate the effort necessary to live well. Okay, so when you share that story on your social networks, make sure to share how self-destructive the initial behavior was and how hard it was to get to the better life. All right, great. Thanks so much, everybody, and I will see you in the next episode. One last thing, remember to check out my memory course. You can use these strategies to get better grades on your tests, to remember people's names, and even help you to remember those jokes you keep forgetting. So you will be amazed. avid.fm/memorymaster. That's avid, AVID.fm/memorymaster. Thanks.